welcome to Code Night New Zealand. And tonight we have a special guest, Will Velida. How are you?
I'm good, mate. How are you?
Do well, thank you. I guess it was amusing just seeing you like watching the countdown.
Yeah, I made a comment last time, so I was just like, do I mention it again? And just become like a recurring theme. Yeah, okay. I'm going to provide the context. I'm always going to provide the context. So, for those of you who don't know, I'm from the UK. And if anyone has ever watched BBC News, that's the countdown music. And I love it. So, it makes it feel more dramatic, gets the adrenaline pumping, means we're going to have a good night.
Well, I knew like we were gonna talk about it, so thanks for
I'm
brought that up.
sorry.
All right, and like we're bringing like tonight like an interesting topic, right? Introduction to radios. What is radios, and what are we gonna be talking about?
Well, I certainly hope it's going to be interesting. Essentially, Radius is kind of like a unified platform where we can actually collaborate between developers and operators to build cloud native applications. As I'll mention, it's an opinionated framework, and it's not meant to replace kind of like 12-factor theory or infrastructure as code. It's not that. It actually builds on top of that to provide developers and operators kind of an easier way to develop and operate their cloud native applications.
All right. Well, interesting to see like what are bringing that up. It's always like great content. Before like Will, you get to start. Let me just share like something for newcomers, people just like joining the session for the first time. So we are Code Night user group. So we're a community group of developers. We love coding. We follow best practices, software development languages and technologies, right? In general, we tend to focus more on Microsoft stack, but we're open to any technologies. Um, as you're gonna notice, as you come like to all of our sessions, so the intent of the user group is to enable developers with practical knowledge to excel and launch their careers, right? So if you're a junior, you're a lead or a lead dev, you're always gonna get like great content from our sessions. I'd like to mention that we are parts of AzureTire.com, where like we're just group of professionals that get to talk about the cloud native, what's the greatest and latest in that space. Also, like we're sponsored by the .NET Foundation, right, which is an entity that looks after the different .NET open source projects, right? So, uh, well, with no further ado, Will, I'm just gonna bring your screen, and the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you. So, for those of you who may not have seen me before, my name is Will Valida. I'm a lead software engineer working for the Mantle Group based in Melbourne, Australia. I've been in Melbourne now for just over 6 months, so not too long. I used to, prior to living in Melbourne, living and working in Melbourne, I was a software engineer based in Auckland. So, hopefully, a few familiar faces on the chat tonight. I've also studied at the University of Auckland, worked in the banking industry. I've done a little bit of consulting for Datacom, where Marcel works now, working with agricultural companies, health companies. And I also used to work for Microsoft in their Fast Track for Azure team. If you want to connect with me just anywhere on the internet, I am usually just at Will Valida. It's a luckily pretty unique name, so no need to fight anyone for that username. But I'm not here to talk about myself. I'm here to talk about Radius. Today is going to be a very gentle 101 introduction to what Radius is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what Radius is and why it's been developed and what it's actually trying to serve. And then I'm going to talk about Radius applications, what that means in terms of the Radius project, and go through other concepts like recipes and environments. Then I'll do a little bit of a deep dive into how the Radius architecture works, how there are three things that really make up the Radius architecture, and how you can actually use it to interact and build Radius applications. And then we'll go through some demos. So there are some slides. We'll try and get through them as quickly as possible, and then we'll just jump into demos. So applications are more than just Kubernetes. Anyone who has seen this diagram or has worked anywhere near the Cloud Native Computing Foundation or the various different technologies and projects that are in the Cloud Native ecosystem would realize that there's so much more to think about than just hosting our applications on Kubernetes. We need to think about what kind of messaging brokers we need, if we need to use proxies, what kind of container registries we're going to be using, API gateways, how we're going to observe and monitor our applications, a whole bunch of things. And when we're developing cloud native applications, there's kind of three common problems that we would usually encounter. So, like I said, standardizing on Kubernetes has been successful for most enterprises. Some of you who have worked in the enterprise space might be carrying like severe battle scars with working with Kubernetes in the enterprise, because it does come with a lot more complexity than it's worth sometimes. I'm sure there are plenty of engineers who are going to be listening to this tonight who have had their boss come in and say, hey, I've learned about this awesome thing called Kubernetes. We should do it, without actually being able to ask why we should use Kubernetes. That's just a basic, that's just a tip of the iceberg when it comes to complexity. So when we actually operate it and try and implement it within our enterprise, it does come with a lot of complexity. Because we don't just run our applications on Kubernetes. It's operating on our resources, maintaining our resources. There are actual full-time jobs dedicated to be able to do that. We also don't develop in isolation anymore, and we really shouldn't, because to develop the type of complex applications that we usually build, we need to collaborate with developers, platform engineers, IT ops people, network engineers, all variety of different types of people, to actually build and maintain the applications that we're providing for our customers. And the tools that we need to do that, actually need to aid collaboration and not impede it. Also, platform engineers that support applications may sometimes lack context about the actual architecture. So if you're developing an application, some organizations are quite siloed. So there are situations where platform engineers will be supporting applications and they don't really understand what the application does. They don't really understand the architecture, what it's meant to do. While on the other side, app developers will actually lack the context about the underlying cloud infrastructure. They'll develop their APIs, they'll have an understanding of that, but then running it on a specific platform, whether that's Azure or AWS, they may not have all the required context to do that successfully. So together, we actually need a common understanding and a way to visualize what our application is, what it's doing, and how we can actually operate it. So this is where Radius comes in. Now, here's a nice quote that I've stolen from their docs website. So Radius is an open source cloud native application platform that enables developers and operators to develop and collaborate on cloud native apps across public and private clouds. It's a nice short sentence and description. And essentially what Radius is trying to do is bridge the gap between developers and operators. So your developers would be able to define the applications that they're building and also their dependencies, while your operators will be able to define the environments that your applications are going to be running on. So Radius will actually bridge the gap between developers and operators, bring them together and deploy apps and infrastructure that meet both of their requirements. So let's start with applications. So Radius applications are the primary resources that brings all your services, dependencies, and relationships together. Essentially, it provides you a single description of your application, allowing you to deploy and manage your application easily. Radius applications are able to actually provide this single description, an entire view of an application via an application graph. And that helps us understand how each component, how our application components are made up and what their relationships are, and which helps us to deploy and understand them a little bit better. Now, Radius applications are designed to be cloud and platform agnostic. So a developer like myself, I'm very heavily involved in the Azure space. There may be other engineers within an organization that are very AWS focused. Radius is not designed to be opinionated towards a particular cloud. it's designed to be agnostic of the cloud and platform that you're actually going to be developing your applications on. Because once you've defined it, Radius is essentially saying, okay, this is an application, I can deploy it to whichever cloud Radius supports. Currently, at the time of recording, it's just Azure and AWS. I think GCP is being worked on. I'm not sure when that's going to be available, but just for today, it's just Azure and AWS. And this is great because if we need to move our application between clouds, or perhaps a more realistic example, we might be working between on-prem environments and cloud environments. Radius essentially is just a platform that we can define our application, define their dependencies. Operators can kind of define the environments, and Radius can just deploy it to a particular cloud. So again, developers will define their requirements and dependencies that their application requires, and then operators can go away, can really define environments and use something called recipes to bind those requirements to the appropriate cloud resources that that application needs. So I've used this word recipes, and this is a concept in Radius that's a little important to understand. So what recipes are, they enable a separation of concerns between IT operators and developers by kind of automating the infrastructure deployment. So as a developer, I can sit here in my room, do a little, code my API or code whatever my application is, and I can select the resources that I want in my application. So I might decide I need a cache, I might need a message broker, I might need a data store. So I'll define those dependencies within the application. And what platform engineers can do is they'll codify their environment to how those resources should be deployed and configured. So when I deploy my application and its resources, what the recipes do is they automatically deploy the backing infrastructure and kind of bind it to the developer's resources. So taking this cache, for example, within my application, I say, okay, I'm going to need a cache to meet a particular need within my application. Operators might say, okay, well, from a cloud platform perspective, we might use Azure Cache for Redis. We're integrating that within a virtual network, so we're going to need a private endpoint. That means we're going to need to specify a particular SKU and plan that Redis cache should be deployed. And we also want to add a little bit of logging and monitoring within that cache just to see how it's doing, and maybe stream that to something like Log Analytics or Grafana. So we define that within a Radius recipe, which could be supported, which could be written in either Bicep or Terraform. Now, you don't necessarily have to create recipes yourself from scratch. Radius does provide some recipes out of the box, but you also, if you have your own kind of like compliance requirements, or you have a particular way that you want to build your infrastructure or deploy your infrastructure or manage it, you can create custom recipes to support that. Now, environments in Radius are essentially kind of like a landing zone for applications that's really configured with your organization's chosen best practices, settings, and recipes. And what they essentially do is they encapsulate and store configuration for your compute platform, network configuration, diagnostics, any other operational concerns that you have. Environments kind of encapsulate all of that. And the great thing about environments is you can actually configure them to vary across different types of deployment environments. So you can have a Radius environment for your staging environment, or you could have a Radius environment for production. You can even change it to deployment regions. So if you have an application that's going to be deployed in multiple regions, you can configure environments to change across various different regions that you're going to be deploying to, and also even different clouds. So if you're running an active-active kind of workload and you're distributing that between Azure and AWS, you can configure your Radius environments to work with those two different clouds. And platform engineers will actually use environments to kind of, they'll collaborate with app developers by managing the sets of environments that developers can use. And when an application is deployed, Radius will bind the app to the configuration of your target environment and apply relevant settings. So you can imagine in a development environment, if you're doing a little bit of cost management, you might want to provision just a basic Redis cache, Azure Redis cache, so you have a cache that developers can use and they can test their application, but you're not breaking the bank by provisioning a premium Redis cache within your developer environment, so you can actually separate your different environments to use different SKUs. That's just one example of how you can use different configurations for different environments. And operational configuration in the environment also helps actually increase developer velocity, because the app doesn't need to change when it's deployed across various different environments. That's really done by the heavy lifting of the environments itself. So a little bit of a deep dive now into the Radius architecture before we jump into a demo. So the overall architecture of Radius has 3 parts. It's got its general resource management API. It's also got its resource providers that it uses for different clouds for cloud native applications. And then finally, the tools for deploying and actually managing Radius applications via its API. So let's start with the general resource management provider. So the Radius API uses a centralized hub and spoke approach, where essentially the Radius API is a single entry point for authentication, routing, authorization, etc. All HTTP traffic into the API comes through the central point. So essentially validation is done at this central point before we route that to the appropriate resource provider. So say if I want to create, I want to use a cache within my application, and I'm going to be deploying that Redis cache to Azure. Essentially, the API will do some validation, making sure that from a Radius perspective, that cache makes sense before it gets routed off to the Azure resource provider saying, go and create this Azure Redis cache for me. And this is called the universal control plane. This universal control plane is also actually a good, actually a central point for extensibility as well. So each resource provider is actually registered centrally, so that the UCP knows where to send requests for that resource type. So when requests come in for that cache, the universal control plane will know, okay, this is going to be an Azure Redis cache. I'm going to route it off to that Azure Resource Manager provider, so Azure Redis cache will be created. It also contains functionality for federating with separate resource managers, as well as its resource providers, so that they can actually, the UCP can route to request to AWS or Azure to manage resources. So now we come to the provided resource providers that Radius provides for you out of the box. So the role of this is to perform really CRUD operations associated with one or more resource types. So you've got core resources of the application, which could include the app itself, containers, gateways, routes. There's integration with Dapper. Radius is was born from the Microsoft incubation hub, so it shares kind of like the same organization as Dapper. So there's integration with the Dapper programming model, which supports management of building blocks and configuration. There's resource providers for data stores, messaging services, and there's also support for functionality for processing bicep deployments. So resource providers themselves will only accept traffic from your universal control plane. So essentially the resource providers will assume that any requests that come to that UCP are authorized. Each resource provider and the set of resource types that it handles has to be registered with the UCP. And we'll talk a little bit about how we can actually do that in a demo. And these are essentially the bulk of resources that come out of the box. And it helps you manage platform resources used to run an app. You can respond to the CLI, storing and retrieving dependency information, like connection strings, executing recipes to create cloud infrastructure, etc. Now, tools to work with Radius. For kind of the demo today, we're going to be working primarily with the RAD CLI, the Radius CLI, and Bicep. There is support for Terraform. It is coming. It's kind of almost there, but not quite. So essentially, these tools will work with Radius to actually interact with the API. So CRUD operations provided by resource providers we use these tools to interact with the API, which then go on to make those CRUD operations against resource providers. The RAD CLI also manages and handles management of operational requests that we send to the Radius API, and I'll talk a little bit about how we can do that in the demo. We can create resources declaratively within a bicep file and then deploy it through the RAD CLI. And then once we send this request, what the CLI does, it monitors the bicep deployment resource, and then we can actually view how that deployment is going within our terminal. And we'll see an example of this coming up. Cool. So that was a very quick kind of 15-minute or so explanation of what Radius is. So let's jump into our first demo. So now we're going to build our first application. So what I'm going to do, I'm in my command line. Is that coming through all right?
Yep, it's looking good.
Awesome. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new directory, Coding Nights. I'm going to actually cd into that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to initialize a Radius environment. And that's going to ask me whether I want to set up an application within this current directory. I'm going to create, select yes. That's going to go ahead and initialize Radius. So I've provisioned an AKS cluster, AKS RAD-W, and it's going to initialize or create a new environment. It's going to create a new namespace for me in Kubernetes, and I'm going to use a local dev recipe pack. And I'll talk about a little bit about recipes in the next demo. So by default, RAD init, that command there, will get you up and running with a local development focused environment where most of the environment configuration is kind of handled for you, including the recipes. So that local dev recipe pack are recipes that will come out of the box. You can fully customize your environment as well. There are options that you can provide this RAD init command.
So that would be like boilerplates.
Yes, boilerplates.
Right
yeah,
now.
That's a good way of kind of putting it. We were actually having a bit of a conversation, Marcel and I, where recipes kind of feel conceptually close to AZD and CLI. It's just with Radius, it's you have the ability to create kind of your own custom recipes as well. So there's some provided out of the box, but you can also add like your own custom Radius recipes.
We got like some questions in here, Will, just bringing that up. So it's just like the scenario here from Ajmal. So one question, like for a private AKS cluster where the public IP is not allowed, second statement, how does it work with Envoy load balancer?
That is a good question. I'm not too sure. Let me go away and think about that. Yeah, I'm not too sure about that. Sorry, Admiral. Yeah, we'll continue with the demo. Let me sit on that. So now what I want to do, so that if I just go into Visual Studio Code, I'm running the Insiders one because the Bicep extension is very specific to Radius. So at the moment, it's if you're working with Bicep in Visual Studio Code, the provider that's the like stable provider doesn't support Radius just yet. It's like a separate extension that you use to interact with Radius. So when that's going to be kind of merged together, where you can just work with kind of Visual Studio Code out of the box with Bicep, I'm not too sure, but at the moment, that's why I'm running Insiders, and I've got a separate extension for Radius. So yeah, Radius Bicep. Right. This is a custom Bicep language support for Visual Studio Code. So they've just essentially forked it to support Radius. Anyway, so if I open up that first app, that's given me a Bicep file. But I'm going to go back into the command line because what I want to do is I can just demonstrate how applications we can see all of our resources and relationships within our Radius application. And to do that, go Ray, show Coding Nights. And I want to output that as JSON. Hopefully that's the right one. Yes. Okay. So here I can see my full app definition in its beautiful raw JSON form. So this ID here is really if you're familiar with kind of how output for JSON objects in ARM provider are. This will look fairly familiar to you. And the ID is really the fully qualified UCP resource of an application, which it's identified within Radius. Location is where your application resides. It's global for now. That's kind of how it is out of the box for Radius at the moment. And this will correspond to the cluster where Radius is running. The environment here that will specify the Radius environment, which the application binds to at deployment. And then you've got your compute platform at the moment. So it's just Kubernetes at the moment. When Radius project was kind of being worked on internally at Microsoft, it used to be just container apps, but now it's just Kubernetes. So to take a look inside the application and see what's deployed, I'll just clear that. And I'm going to run rad app connections. And what this is going to do, that's going to print the application's resources and relationships. And there's nothing there because it's empty and we haven't deployed anything. So what we're going to do, we're actually going to start building out our application. So if I go back into Visual Studio Code, I'm going to just get out of that, open this one. Okay. Is that the right one? No, it's not. Go into the proper one. Apologies. Cool. So there we go. So in our bicep file, we're going to define all the resources. So our containers, gateways, cloud services, that's essentially going to make up our application, including how they're all going to be connected to each other. What the Radius application does, what these files do, it makes it simple to kind of consistently deploy and manage your application. So this, when I ran that rad init command, this was the bicep file that was created. So to deploy this, I'm going to go back into my terminal. I'm going to go rad deploy. I'm going to deploy that app.bicep. Press enter. That's going to go ahead, kind of build my template up, and then deploy it.
When you say deploy it, like deploy it locally?
Yes, deploy it locally. So this is just a local deployment for now. So the great thing about doing like YouTube videos, you can go with the power of video editing to kind of cut this out. But that didn't take too long, which is good. So now if I run rad app connections, if I actually write application app, not spell app properly. Cool. So now I can see the underlying Kubernetes resources that were created to run it. So I've got a deployment, I've got service account, and role with role binding resources there. So Radius environments map how applications bind to a particular platform. So earlier within that JSON output, we saw that our compute was set to Kubernetes and we had a default namespace for it. What that essentially means is that the container resources are deployed to that particular namespace within the cluster where Radius is installed. So now what I want to do is actually run it. So what I'm going to do, just clear that up, just go rad run app.bicep. And that's going to build again, deployed. And what we should see is a bit of a log stream showing that it's going to be running on localhost. Cool, so there it is. So let me just open that up. And here we are. Here's our beautiful application. It's literally just a container running a kind of a website. There's no connections to find. We're going to do that in the next step. We can find out some network configuration, process information, and some environment variables. And we'll start to see this. This will start to make more sense as we're adding more connections to our Radius application. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. There's also a little to-do list that they provide. We haven't configured a database yet, so all of these will be added to memory. So that adds, but obviously, having stuff that's just stored in memory is not going to be great. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add a database and connection. So I'm going to just stop my application. And now I'm going to open up my bicep file again. And now I'm just going to copy and paste some bicep code. I'm going to just copy and paste a parameter for my environment. And then I'm also going to be adding a MongoDB database. Now, one thing that we didn't really have to do when we're defining this resource, when we're adding our MongoDB, so we don't need to specify how or where to run the underlying infrastructure, because essentially what's happening here is that the Radius environment and the recipes really take that for you. Just like how the Radius environment is now bound to a container in a Kubernetes cluster, it's also deployed and bound to our Mongo database underlying infrastructure using recipes. So you can imagine if I'm on in a platform engineering team, I'm developing a recipe that for a MongoDB database that's going to comply to my organizational policies, which then I could just provide as like a bicep resource to my developers. So when they say, okay, we're going to need a MongoDB database, this is the recipe that we're going to be using for that. And we can actually use the CLI to learn a little bit more about the underlying recipe. So if I go rad recipe show, might not be the right namespace, resource type, and then I get the resource provider, so applications, data store / Mongo databases. Hopefully that's right. That will show me details, my super secure admin password, username and password combination. So it will show you kind of like the underlying details of the recipes, including available parameters and defaults. So for those of you that work in Bicep, you may be familiar with the concept of parameter names, types, default values, min and max for validation. When you're developing your recipes, you develop them as kind of like Bicep resources. And then when developers want to find out about them, essentially they can run this command to find out a little bit more about your recipe, rather than them having to ping you on Teams all the time. Not that we don't enjoy being pinged on Teams.
Hey, Will, just like a question, because like you're provisioning that, simulating as if you had like Kubernetes on your local environment. Do you have like Minikube or any sort of local Kubernetes on your machine?
So, just to correct what I kind of said earlier, so I've got an AKS cluster that I'm using as my Kubernetes context. So it's not Minikube that I'm running. I'm not running a Kubernetes cluster on a Minikube. I'm using my AKS cluster that I provisioned in Azure.
All right, cool.
Cool. So now if I want to connect that MongoDB database to this, this front end, what I want to do is just essentially add a connection. And from here, I can add all kinds of stuff. So I can add my MongoDB database. I can add a cache. I can add another container, which I'll show you, how to do in a bit. And it's very much like Bicep, where we're just referencing the resource ID of this particular resource block. So this is more, this is really just used to kind of automatically configure access for kind of your containers. So now what we've done here, we've said, okay, this front end container is going to communicate with the MongoDB database. So I'll go back into the Radius, back into my terminal. I'm going to go rad run app.bicep. That's going to go ahead and deploy my application as well as the MongoDB database. It's going to be a container. Since we're using a local dev recipe, it's going to be a container for a MongoDB database. So once that's deployed, hopefully we'll see a log stream started, and then on the same port. This time, yeah, I'm starting to see some logs come through, very busy. So I'll just go back into localhost 3000. now we can see that our MongoDB database is connected to our Radius application. So if I go back into that to-do list, I don't get that a warning text saying that, hey, everything's going to be stored in memory. So when I'm adding items, now they're being added to my MongoDB database. So if I look at the log stream, we'll see the logs are getting poured out from our MongoDB container as well. Cool. So I'm just going to Control-C that, clear up my terminal output. And then again, if I run rad at connections, we should see the container and the Mongo database that we deployed, along with the underlying Kubernetes resources that were created to run them. So here now I've got my connection to MongoDB and also the resources needed to support my MongoDB database. Cool. So in addition to dependencies, one thing that we can do is add more containers to our application to make it more modular. So if you're working with microservices, or if they're like modular monoliths and you want to separate that up, you can actually add containers to make that a little bit more modular. So what I'm going to do, just going to copy and paste for time, a backend container. And then very similar to how I connected my MongoDB database to my demo UI container, essentially I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to put backend, I'm going to provide a source, and I'm going to point it to the URL, to the port that that container is going to be on. Let's go ahead and save that. And then I'm going to run that again. That's going to deploy, this time, my UI. It's going to deploy my MongoDB database and also the backend. And that's going to show up as a Radius connection. So once that's started, and once that's ready for requests, come on, command line.
It's really cool to see that no YAML, only JSON, bicep, really.
Well, there is the option to run applications using Helm. So YAML will find a way. It always does, because it is the best markup language in the universe. No complaints, no questions required on that. So there we go. There's my backend container now showing up as a Radius connection. So it's listening on port 80. The host name is backend. So now if we were communicating between our UI and, say, an API, this is how we can connect it together in Radius. And then finally, what we're going to do, I'm just going to Control-C that, clear up my output, then head up back into Visual Studio Code. We can add a gateway to our application. So gateways are kind of used to expose your application to the internet. We can expose a single container or multiple containers. So what I'm going to do, just copy and paste that. And I'm going to put that down here below my MongoDB database. And I'm going to expose it. My UI container here, which is on port 3000, I'm going to use a gateway to kind of expose that UI container. So when we don't necessarily have to hit localhost 3000. Essentially, a URL will be provided for us via the gateway. So what I'm going to do, rad deploy at.bicep. That's going to build, and now it's going to build my UI container, my MongoDB database, my backend, and now my gateway as well. It's also going to provide a public endpoint for me for my gateway. So now, with the power of video editing and staring at a screen, hopefully we'll be provided with a gateway URL. There it is. So instead of directly connecting to the container, traffic gets directed to this gateway URL. And we can see the same kind of metadata for our containers for our MongoDB and also our backend container as before. So instead of hitting localhost 3000, we've essentially hit that gateway URL and there's our Radius application. Cool. So
so just for the gateway, like, is there like a specific container, or like what's the technology behind it?
So I'm not sure what the specific technology is behind it. So whatever kind of local, whatever local recipe that local gateway has been provided by Radius, that's essentially what it's running on. Yeah.
Yep. No, just asking. Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. Pretty cool.
If you have your like own specific technology that you want to use, again, that's where custom recipes come in, where you would define that, and then you could just call that like a resource, like any resource that's in Radius, but it'd be your own custom one.
Okay.
Awesome. So now that's kind of like our first demo. So now what I'm going to try and do, I'm going to go ahead and just clean up my RAD environment. And to do that, we can actually delete it. And that will delete all the Radius resources in our cluster as well. So once that is kind of done, now we're going to move on to deploying recipes. So again, recipes are really that separation of concerns between infrastructure teams and developers by helping us to automate the infrastructure deployment. So as a developer, I can sit with my application team, define what I need, whether that's a Redis cache, MongoDB, or etc. And then the operators will go ahead and define how that will be deployed, whether that's Azure, AWS, Kubernetes, wherever. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to clear this up. Actually, I'll CD back into the demos. I'll clear this up. And I'm going to make a new directory, RAD recipes. And I'm going to initialize a new environment. I'm going to create a new application. Cool. So now what I can do, I can actually use RAD recipe list to list or view the recipes in my environment. And out of the box, we should see, I might just scroll in a little bit. We should see a bunch of kind of recipes already available to us. So we've got ones for Dapper, data stores, and also messaging as well. So there's support for RabbitMQ, SQL databases, Redis cache, MongoDB, for Dapper, there's state stores, secret stores, and also PubSub brokers. And essentially, these development environments are preloaded with what they call, or what's referred to as local dev recipes, which is just essentially a set of recipes that allow us to, quickly spin something up and running with lightweight containerized infrastructure. So essentially, what we're going to do, we're going to start working with some of these recipes. So in this bicep file, I'll just close that. And I'll open up this one in RAD recipes. Yeah, okay. So what I want to do is I'm just going to update my application a little bit. So I'm going to just change the container image I want to use for this. I'm also going to provide a parameter for my environment. I'll provide that as a string. So this is going to be front end. I'm going to name this front end. Come down. I'm going to create a cache. So I'm going to create Redis cache here. I can see we're using that Radius bicep extension. All of these are provided for me. So I can just use applications.datasource Redis cache. Use the latest block. Here, I'm just going to call it a cache. Provide some properties. So the environment, we're going to deploy this cache to our Radius environment, and we're going to be using our application. And we get this information automatically passed through to us using the RAD CLI. And then finally, what I want to do, I'm actually going to take away this port. I don't need it for now. Just this block. Then I'm going to just add a connection. I'm going to connect to this container to my Redis cache. using the resource ID of the specific cache. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into my CLI, and I'm actually going to cd back into rad recipes, get some real estate going, and I'm going to go rad deploy. Is that in the right directory?
I think you put like the root.
Yes, I did. So what I'm going to do is just put that back in there. Yes. That's the great thing about live coding. So what I should see now, this may not work because I don't have a radius environment initialized in there, but it should be, oh no, it should be okay. So with that kind of rad init command, if I look in the directory we were working before, there is a YAML file that kind of gets brought, kind of get created out of that. So my application name, Coding Nights there. So what I may need to do, this rad file here, that's a demo. That's not going to work for me. Okay, so what I'm going to do, we'll try manually putting that in. And I'm just going to rename this rad recipes. These are happy little accidents that occur when we're live coding. Okay, this might prove a little funky, but we should be okay. All right, so what we can actually do now, to see the underlying infrastructure, we can actually run kubectl get pods, just look in the namespace. No resources found. Okay, what I might do, okay, that's kind of cool. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually nuke this and work from the start again. Don't save. The joys of live coding. It's fine. Yes, move. Doing this very quickly. Bit of cleanup. That's okay. What I'm going to do, rad init. Yes, I'm going to set up an application. So, okay, there's my existing environment. Cool, okay. That's giving me this app bicep again. Going to save that. Go back into CLI. I'm going to go rad deploy app bicep. So that's going to deploy my application again. And okay, this is interesting. All right, so what I need to do here, just as part of this cleanup, and we'll do this a little bit later when we're trying to deploy this to Redis, we actually need to delete our resources. And we can actually do this. I'll get some real estate going. So if I go rad resource list, I can list all the Redis caches that are in here. So there's no Redis caches in there. That's fun. I'll try redeploying so I can get that same error message again. So application rad recipes with environment default, workspace default. What I might do, interest of time, because we've got about 10 minutes left. There's different application environments. So they kind of give you two options. We can either change the name, which is what we're going to do, which is the easy one, or we can actually update the existing cache or delete it using that command there. In the interest of time, I'm just going to go call this Redis cache. And I might get the same one error for UI as well. Hopefully not. If I do, we can just change the name. It's fine. What I was kind of hoping would happen with this rad resource list, I'd be able to see a Redis cache there. So it would show me the resource name and also its type. And then from there, we can actually delete resources using the rad CLI as well, just to do cleanup. Yes, the front end one has failed as well. So I'll just append UI. It always goes well during rehearsal, but when you're actually doing it for real, there's always fun, happy accidents that happen. We don't mind that. But essentially, as I was saying, it would show you kind of the list of particular resources. This one, I'm just specifying Redis cache, but if we're using different containers or message brokers or data stores, we can list those out as well. And we can also use the RAD CLI to interact and delete those resources, because the RAD CLI is a tool that we use to interact with the API. Cool. So finally, that has deployed. So hopefully, if I go kubectl get pods namespace, I'm going to try default. Let's have a look. So it's not my default namespace. Let's try default recipes. Let's try rad recipes.
Rad recipes, yeah.
And no. Okay, so for whatever reason, let's see if I just get pods. Okay, never mind. That's okay. So what we're going to do, we'll just clear that up. We'll move on for now. I'll probably figure out as soon as I log off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to expose our front-end containers. So front-end UI, I'm going to expose that on port 3000. So if I go back to localhost 3000, I can see my Radius application. There's my Redis cache. So that's just a Redis container. So I can add existing items to it. New item, and that's all being stored to a Redis cache that's provisioned as a container within Kubernetes. But essentially, what we would like to do with recipes, rather than spinning up a Redis container or maybe a Mongo container, we'd actually like to use Azure to do that for us. So what we're going to do, just kind of interest of time, let's give this a go. So what I could do, let's go rad resource delete. I'm going to delete a Redis cache, and my Redis cache, what was it called again? Redis cache. Let's see if this works. Yes. Okay. So that's going to ask me if I want to make sure if I do want to delete my Redis cache. So I'll go ahead and delete that. And now what I want to do is I want to provision a Redis cache in Azure instead. So with my particular environment, what I want to do is just register that recipe. So I'll just copy and paste out, but I will explain it. So here we're registering an Azure recipe. We're provisioning it for this environment. It's going to be a bicep template. The template path, so this is where it lives. So this is one of the templates that the Radius project have provided for us. But say if you're using Azure Container Registry to store bicep templates, you could essentially store a Radius recipe on your Azure Container Registry and point it to that and just declare what kind of resource type it is. So if I go ahead into that, I've now successfully linked my recipe to my Radius environment. So one thing that you will need to do, and hopefully this will kind of work. So what I'm going to do, I need to update my Radius environment to work with my Azure subscription and ID. So this is really just, I'm going to update my default environment, subscription ID. I'm not providing it at the moment, because what I'll do is I'll take my terminal off the screen just a little bit while I post in my subscription ID, as well as the resource group where I want to deploy my resources to. So this is the resource group that I want to deploy my resources to. So you see there's my Kubernetes cluster already. Press enter, and that's going to provide an output back saying that successfully updated my environment. So I'll bring my CLI back. And, oh, no, I've got one thing I need to register. Now what I need to do is I've created a service principal with a role assignment. So essentially now I'm authorizing the Radius CLI or the Radius API to, or control plane, sorry, to go and create resources for that particular resource group. To do that, we can actually register the credential with our Radius environment. So just provide the client ID, client secret, and also my tenant ID. So if you've ever worked with service principals in Azure, this is essentially how we can actually do it via the command line and register credentials in our Radius environment. So I'll go ahead and just quickly do that. That's not what I wanted. So essentially just copy and paste my client ID as well. In the future, I have these set up ahead of time. That would have saved me a bit of time, but that's okay. We still got time. Cool. So now I've registered that credential for my Radius environment, and you'll get an output saying that, you know, it might take a few seconds just to kind of reload. Or for those credentials to be valid. So now what I want to do is I want to go back into my bicep file and essentially using this kind of default recipe, using this default recipe that Radius provides, what I'm going to do is simply put Radius recipe and the name Azure. So that's going to update my cache resource to use the Azure recipe instead of the default recipe. So now what I want to do is rad deploy my app.bicep. That's going to go ahead and build my recipe. If everything goes as planned, it will take a little bit of time because we are deploying an Azure Cache for Redis resource in our Azure subscription. But once that's complete, we should be able to use the AZ CLI to kind of query the Redis cache, see its name. And then when we're writing new items in our to-do list, we're actually persisting that in our Redis cache that's in Azure rather than just a container. So that's going to go ahead, and that will take a little bit of time. Yeah. What I might do. Let's just see how that's going. So let's see what's happening within my resource group. Okay, so we can see the Redis cache is being provisioned. And it's creating a basic 250 megabyte one. So out of the box for like the Azure one, Azure recipes, and also AWS one, they will have specific SKUs that you can use within that. So now, if you use kind of the recipe CLI to describe the recipe, there could be parameters that provide that. So while we're actually waiting for that, let's see if we can go ahead and do that. So that would be the default one. Let me see if I can be a little bit clever and just innovate, make some stuff up on the spot. So instead of that, what I want to do, see if it will show me the ones for Azure. Instead of data stores, make sure I've got the resource provider right. It's Redis cache. Is it cache or caches?
Caches.
Caches. Okay, let's see if we can see the recipe using this show. Yeah. So there we go. So
Cool.
using this rad CLI command, we can see that, okay, we can provide a particular SKU name, a particular SKU family, capacity, and also location. And by default, it's just creating a basic cache and provisioning it in the location of our resource group. So if I go back into Azure, I can see that this resource group is in Australia East. So that is going to be deploying that cache to Australia East. And it failed. Let's see how it failed. It's an authorization thing. Okay, so in a perfect world where demos work live first time, essentially that would have registered my Redis cache, and then that would have just essentially run the same container, but instead of interacting with a local or with a Redis container in Kubernetes, that would actually interact with a remote Redis container, Redis cache. Cool. So apologies about that, folks. I did make one earlier and then I deleted it. Not sure why now, looking back, but it's fine, whatever. So that's really the end of kind of the demo, bit of a disappointing end, so I do apologize. But if you do want to, if I just go back to my slides, I'll just change the presenter set. So if you do want to learn more about the Radius project, it is a developing project. I really recommend checking out the docs. It's a great place to kind of get started and have a little bit of a tinker around with Radius project. And they've got a few tutorials there, which are worth checking out. It is an open source project, so definitely check them out on GitHub. If you're working with the project, you notice anything's wrong, or you have an idea and you want to contribute, check them out on GitHub. They've also got an entire hands-on lab. It's about 60 minutes long. This was actually shared with me by Luke Murray. So Luke, if you're watching, thanks for sharing that. They've got a whole hands-on lab which you can kind of walk through, which shows a bit more of an end-to-end example than I've showed tonight. Cool. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks for spending your evening with me. If you want to connect, hang out, just ping me a question anytime. There's all my socials. I am on one of them in any particular point of the day. I do sometimes post stuff to YouTube. I need to get back into it a little bit more now that I've settled down in Melbourne. But I also blog a lot. So wilverleader.com is where I will post ramblings about all variety of different coding concepts, architectural concepts, and just general tech stuff.
Well,
awesome.
Thank you, Will. That was really interesting. I really liked seeing that Red provides CLI. Basically just dealing with that. Even when you're querying, for the last time when we were connected to the Redis cache on Azure, right? So you got the details from the Red CLI. It's interesting. Yeah. I'm definitely going to explore that one. Thanks for bringing that topic, right? Hopefully that anyone that comes and check this video, just take it as a reference, as an example, because there are great insights in there. Probably the content's available on documentation, but it's always when you get to see someone doing the work, you just see, well, how easy it can be, right? Rather than just dive into documentation, right? So, well, thank you very much for your time, right? I'm not sure if the audience has any other questions. If not, let's just give few more seconds. But I know that you're pretty busy, Will, and what's next for you?
So next week, I'll be speaking at NDC Sydney, not about Radius. I will be talking about messaging patterns in Azure. So yeah, if you're at NDC Sydney, feel free to come up, say hi, ask me questions on anything. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it.
Cool. Yep, just checking here. Nope, I think we're good on questions. Thank you very much again, Will. Thank you for the audience. And yeah, we're catching up the end of this month. We have another session coming up. And yeah, I think this is it. And well, catch you guys soon. Cheers.
Awesome.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.